What's going on, guys? Welcome to my express.js crash course. So this is a revamped, updated version of the one that I did about 5 years ago. I also just revamped my Node.js crash course. You can find a link to that in the description. Node.js is a JavaScript runtime environment, and if you're brand new to Node, I would definitely suggest that you watch that one first. It's going to give you a better understanding of what Node.js is and how it works. But if you're ready to dive into Express, let's get started. All right, so we're going to be covering a lot of stuff in this video. We're going to spend just a few minutes in some slides to talk about what Express is and what it's used for. Then we'll jump into Express project and we'll look at things like creating routes, the request response objects, middleware, error handling, and more. So let's first establish what Express is. So Express is a minimal and flexible Node.js web framework that provides a robust set of features for web and mobile applications, and it's used for both server-side applications as well as APIs and microservices. I would say that it's most used for building back-end APIs that are consumed by front-end frameworks, and you've probably heard of the MERN stack, which is MongoDB, Express, React, Node.js. There's also the mean stack, the Maven stack, where you can swap out React for Angular or Vue, or really any front-end technology that you want, even just vanilla JavaScript. So it's a very popular framework. In fact, I would say it's the framework for Node.js. There are others. I'd say there's even frameworks that are more powerful, but Express has really established itself as the go-to framework for Node.js. And it's used by huge companies like IBM, Uber, Nike, and a bunch of others. It's also a really popular option for smaller projects and startups. So Express simplifies the process of handling HTTP requests. If you watched my Node.js crash course, we started to build an API from scratch just using the HTTP module, and you saw how difficult and how low level it was. Well, Express gives us a ton of tools to work with to make building APIs and just working with HTTP much easier. And Express is a very fast and unopinionated framework, which I just want to spend a couple minutes on. So when it comes to web frameworks, you have two types. You have opinionated and unopinionated. An opinionated framework is one that has a lot of rules and conventions that you need to follow. So there's basically recommended ways of doing things. And it's very structured. It's going to guide you in a certain direction. They also come with, or they usually come with, a lot of bells and whistles out of the box. Things like authentication, CLIs, database ORMs. And some examples of opinionated frameworks are Ruby on Rails, Django, Laravel. If we're talking about Node.js in particular, Nest.js and Adonis are opinionated frameworks for Node. And I would say in general, opinionated frameworks are more popular. I think Node and Express is really the only exception I can think of where the most popular framework is a minimalistic, unopinionated one. So unopinionated frameworks are extremely flexible, and there's not really a right way to do things. You can structure your application however you want and use whatever libraries you want. You can use whatever database you want. It's very minimalistic, and it's up to you to decide how you want to structure your application. There's not as many rules to follow, but you also don't get as many features or bells and whistles out of the box. But you do get the necessities, and of course you can install other packages for the functionality that you need. So there's definitely pros and cons to both. I would say it's really features versus freedom. Depends on what means more to you for that project. So there's a few things that you should know before you jump into Express. You should have a good understanding of JavaScript, obviously, all the fundamentals, as well as all the ES6 features, arrow functions, destructuring, promises, async await. You should have a basic understanding of Node.js. You don't have to know a lot. In fact, I would say watching my 2-hour crash course is plenty before you jump into Express. You should know how to use NPM, how to install packages, and in many cases you'll be working with JSON data, but you can also use a template engine like EJS or Pug, and I'm going to actually give you an example of that later on. But yeah, you can build both server-side applications as well as JSON APIs, microservices, etc. And if you're learning, let's say, the MERN stack, it doesn't really matter which order you learn the technologies. If you want to learn React and you want to learn the front end first, that's fine. Or you could do Node and Express first and then learn React. What's really important is that you know JavaScript before you jump to either one of those, front or back end. Now, as far as what we're going to do here, obviously we're going to set up a server. We're going to look at routing, how to handle requests. We're going to look at the request and response cycle and the request response objects to see how we can get things like the response body, how we can get the headers, things like that. We're going to look at custom middleware. So middleware functions basically sit in between the request and response, and you can do all sorts of things. We'll create some custom logging middleware. We're going to look at CRUD operations, so create, read, update, and delete. We're basically going to create a full CRUD API. At the end, we'll look at template engines. We're going to use the EJS, which is embedded JavaScript, because you can render HTML pages directly from your server as well. It doesn't have to be JSON data. We're going to look at error handling, creating custom error handling middleware, third-party NPM packages, controllers. So I'm going to show you how we can actually clean up our code and take our code out of the route file and put it into a file that has a bunch of controller methods. Fetching data from the front end, so I'll give you an example of how we can create a static file server, and we can basically have front end JavaScript that will make a request and fetch data from our Express API. And we'll look at environment variables. We'll look at a lot more too, but these are the core things that I want to go over. All right, so that's it for slides. Let's jump in and get started. Okay, so this is express.js.com. This is where you can find the documentation. There's some guides here on routing and middleware, and you can use this as kind of a supplement to this crash course. So to install Express, just like any other package, you can just install it with NPM. So we'll get to that, but we're going to jump into VS Code or open whatever text editor you use and go into some empty folder where you want to create this project. Now, this isn't an actual project that we're going to be working on like I do in many of my videos. We're just going to kind of explore. We will be building a CRUD API. It'll be a JSON API that will create, read, update, and delete posts, but we're also going to look at loading HTML files. We're going to look at using template engines, creating middleware, error handling, all kinds of stuff. All right, so just open up a folder, and in our terminal, since this is a Node.js project, and obviously you have to have Node installed. If you don't, just go to nodejs.org. So the first thing you're going to want to do is create a package.json file. And I'm not going to explain every single little detail like what a package.json file is, because you should know that. If you don't, just go ahead and watch the Node crash course. So we're going to run npm init, and I'm just going to do -y so we don't have to go through the questions. And that will create the package.json file with all the defaults. Okay, now to install Express, as you saw on the home page, we can simply run npm install, or I, and then Express. Okay, and that will get added as a dependency. As you can see right here, it also created the node modules folder. Now at this point, I usually like to create a .gitignore file. And what that'll do is whatever you put in here, it will not be pushed to your Git repository, and you never want to push your node modules folder, so you pretty much always want to create this. And I'm also going to put .env in here, just in case we have an environment .env file. Usually you don't want to push that either, because that's usually where you have things like API keys, things you don't want to share. All right, so let's create an entry point, and I'm going to call it server.js. And typically the convention I like to use is if I'm creating an API or like a MERN stack application where I'm serving JSON data, I'll call it server.js, the entry point. If I'm building a Node app that uses a template engine like EJS, then I'll call it app.js. That's just kind of what I like to do, but obviously you can call it whatever you want. So let's go ahead and bring in Express, and I'm using the common JS syntax, which is like the native Node module syntax. Later on, I'll show you how you can switch it up if you want to use ES modules and you want to use the import syntax. But for now, we'll just go ahead and use the require, and we're going to require Express, and then we want to initialize Express into a variable called app. And this app variable, or this object, this is basically what we use for everything, to create routes, to use middleware, to start the server and listen on a port, which is what I'm going to do right now. We're going to call the listen method, and that takes in a port number. Usually I'll use 5,000 for backend stuff. However, that's being used on this machine, so I'm going to use 8,000. And then there's an optional function callback you can pass in. Actually, we don't even need curly braces. And we're just going to do a console log to just say that the server is running. So we'll say server is running on port 8000. And those 3 lines will actually allow you to run a server. So if I come down here and I run node and then the name of the file, either server.js or just server, there we go. So now it's running. It's not doing anything. There's no routes, so there's not really any requests we can send for it to do anything, but it is running. So I'm going to stop that now with controller command C. And the next thing we'll do is just add a very, very simple route. And we can do that with the app object. And then depending on what type of method you want to handle, if it's a GET request or POST request, you use that method. In this case, we'll use a GET method. So this is going to say respond to a GET request to / just the root URL or endpoint. And then that takes in a second argument of a function, and that function takes in a request and response object. And those objects just have a ton of stuff on them. So whatever you want to get from the headers, the body, or query strings from the URL, that's all in the request object. The response object has a bunch of methods we can use. So let's use the send method, and we'll just send some text. So we'll say hello world. And then let's run the server. And we'll go ahead and go to the browser, go to localhost 8000, and we'll see hello world. And what's nice about this is we don't have to define like the content type. We don't have to say HTML or text / plain text or text / HTML. If I put an H1 in here like this, and we do have to restart the server. I'll show you how we can fix that, but for now we do have to restart it. You'll see now it's parsing the HTML. We could even send JSON data. So I could do, let's say, message hello world. And we can, it's just a JavaScript object, but it'll actually stringify it on its own. We don't have to do it manually like we would have to with with Node.js and just the HTTP module like we did in the Node.js course. Also, this is only pertaining to the root route. If I go to /about, then that's not going to work. If I make a post request to the root route, it's not going to work. It has to be a GET request because that's what we defined. So we don't have to manually check for that stuff like we would without using Express. Now, having to restart the server every time we make a change is pretty annoying, so there's a few things you can do. What I've done up until recently is used a third-party package called NodeMon, which is really easy to set up. You just install it with NPM. But with recent versions of Node.js, you can actually use the watch flags. You don't have to use a third-party package. So I'm going to show you how to do that. In the Node.js crash course, we did use NodeMon, so you can check that out if you want to. If you do want to know how to do that. But let's go ahead and stop this. And I'm going to go into the package.json here. And what we want to do is create a couple scripts. And to create NPM scripts, we just go into this object. I'm going to create 2. I'm going to create one called start, which is just going to start it normally, just like we just did with the node and then the name of the file. But then I'm going to also create a dev script which watches it so that we don't have to keep restarting. So we can just simply do node -- watch and then server, or whatever you called the file. So now if I save that and come down here and we run npm run dev, you'll see that now it's running on port 8000. And it does say watch mode is an experimental feature and might change at any time, but I'm pretty sure that it's not going to change. So you should be able to use that. But let's go ahead and try it out. So I'm going to change this back to just a string of hello world and save. And I didn't restart it myself. It did it on its own. And if I come back and reload, now we just get the string. Okay, so now we don't have to worry about restarting it. Now the next thing I want to do, well, let's just create another route just so you can see. So we'll create one at /about, and we'll just return, say, about. Okay, so now if I come back here and I go to /about, get request, then we see about in the browser. Now, most of what we're going to be doing is dealing with JSON data, but I do want to show you how you can serve HTML pages, and there's a few ways to do that. This first way I'm going to show you really isn't what you're going to do, and that would be create a separate route for every single page. You can do this in a much easier way by just creating a static server, but I do want to show you this way just so you know how it works. So this res object has a method called sendFile. So I want to send an HTML file when we hit a route. So I'm going to create a folder called public, and let's say this is where we want to have our HTML files. So I'll create index.html. We'll just go ahead and create a boilerplate here. I'll just say welcome. We'll say welcome to the home page, and then I'm also going to create an about.html. And we'll say welcome to the about page. Okay, so we have these two HTML files. Now I'm going to go into this root route, and let's do a res.sendFile. And this will take in an absolute path to whatever you want to load. And there's a few ways we can do this. I'm going to go ahead and bring in the path module. So we'll say path. I'm going to require, and this is just it's kind of like a utility to just help with file paths. So in this send file, we can use this _dir name, and that will basically give us the path to the current file that we're in, or the current location that we're in, I should say the directory. And then from there, we want to go to the public folder and then the index.html. That's the page that I want to load. So we can actually wrap this in path.join, which just allows you to join together folders and files. So we'll say from the dir name, then we want to go into public, then we want to go to index.html. So that'll give us the absolute path to the index.html file. So I'm going to save that, and actually, you know what, let's just copy this and we'll do the same with the about. Change this to about HTML. And now if I reload the home page here, we get welcome to the home page. If I go to /about, we get welcome to the about page. So that's one way to do it if you just want to load HTML files. But you can imagine if you have a lot of files, you're going to have to create a bunch of routes just to load a single page, and that's kind of silly. So what you can do is use the express static middleware. So to do that, we're going to come right here, and we just need to add a line. So let's say setup, we'll say setup static folder. And basically, we're going to declare one of our folders to be static, meaning you can just go to the URL and it will just work. And we're going to set public to be our static folder. So to do that, we can say app.use, because this is middleware. Middleware is just a function that runs between the incoming request and the outgoing response. And we want to pass in here express.static, just like that. Now this takes in the location of where you want your static folder, which in our case is public. So we can again use path.join, and same thing, we'll just do _dir name, and then we want to go to public. Okay, so if I do that and then I just get rid of these two routes completely, and we come back to the home page and reload, it still works. Now, if I go to /about, even though I have that about.html, it's not going to work because I actually have to specify the .html. If I do that, it does work. So now anytime I wanted to create an HTML, like let's say I want contact.html, all I have to do is create it in this folder and it will automatically work. I don't have to create a separate route for it. So that's how you create a static server with Node.js. Now, I want to move on to working with JSON data, because the chances are that's what you're learning Express for. And again, I'll get into template engines as well, which allows you to load HTML pages, but also use dynamic data. You can pass data into the route and into the page. But let's go ahead and we'll just leave the static here. Well, no, let's comment it out for now because we're going to use it later, because I do want to show you how we can interact with our JSON data through these HTML files. But for now, we'll just comment that out. And let's create a new row. We'll say app.get. And let's say I want this to be /API. That's a common convention, is just to have, if it's a JSON API, prefix all your endpoints with API. So we'll say API / and let's do posts. And then we have our request response, our function. And usually you're going to be dealing with a database, but let's just go ahead and hard code some posts here. So we'll say const posts. Actually, I'm going to use let, and you'll see why later. But we're going to use let, and let's set an array. And all I'm going to have is an ID and a title. I'm not going to get crazy here. So we'll say ID1, title. Oops, we don't want quotes around that. Title. We'll say post1. Well, I got 2 colons there. So post1, and then we'll just copy that down a couple times. Post2, 3. Change this up, 2, 3. All right, so let's just pretend that this is in a database. So we want to serve these posts through this endpoint. So let's do res. Now we can do res.send, and like I showed you before, you can pass JSON in there, or you can pass a JavaScript object and it will get parsed as or stringified as JSON. But there's also a specific JSON method, and that's what I prefer to use. So we're going to do res.json and then simply pass posts, which is just a JavaScript array of objects. But if we go back to Chrome now, and we go back to, let's go to /API/posts, now we get our JSON posts. Okay, and you could hit this endpoint from your React application or Vue or your mobile app, whatever it is you're using. You could hit that endpoint and get this data. Dealing with a JSON API, the browser isn't the best tool to use, because you want to be able to test posts and put and deletes. So there's a ton of tools that you can use to do that. Postman is what I prefer, and there's a desktop version. There's also a VS Code extension, which I have installed. So that's what I'm going to use. If you want to use that as well, just search for Postman under extensions. So this right here, you can install it. You do have to create an account, but it's free, so you can just install it, and then you'll have this little icon here, and then you can simply open up a new HTTP request, and then you can choose whatever method you want. Let's say get request to this right here, localhost 8000 API posts, send it, and you can see we get our JSON data in the body here. We can also see the headers here. So we have like X powered by Express. We have the content type, which is automatically application/JSON, content length, etc. All right, so this is what I'm going to use from now on, and I don't even have to leave VS Code to make my requests. Now, before we move on to other routes and all that, I just want to talk about environment variables. So basically, you have variables on your system that you can use called environment variables, and you can also create them in a file called .env. Now, prior to, I think it was, I don't know, a couple versions of Node.js, a couple versions ago, you had to use a third-party package called .env, but now you can actually use an env file without using that package. So I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. So let's create a file called .env. And usually if you have like a Google API key or something like that, you'll put that in this file. So you don't want to push this to GitHub or anywhere else. So that's why usually you want to put this in your gitignore file. Now, I don't have any API keys or anything, so all we're going to put in here is the port number. And I'm going to put that to Just for now, I'll put it to 8080 just so we can, oh, we don't need a semicolon, just so we can make sure that this is being used. And then in server.js, what I'm going to do is come up here. I usually like to put this at the top, and we'll create a variable called port, and I'm going to set that to process.env dot and then port, because that's the name of the environment variable. Okay, now you should also have a fallback just in case that doesn't exist. So we'll say or 8000. And then down here where we're connecting to 8000 here and here, I'm going to change that to, well, here we need to use this syntax because it's a variable. Okay, so now we're using that port variable. So this is going to look in the .env. Now it's not going to work by default. In fact, if I restart the server, you'll see it's not using 8080 as we have in the env. It's using 8000. It's using the fallback. The reason for that is because you have to explicitly describe the env file in your package.json. So right here where we're running the dev script, we're going to add --env-file equals .env, like that. Okay, so now I'll save, and let's now restart the server, and now you'll see it's running on 8080. Okay, so that's how you can use a .env file without having to use the .env package. Now I'm going to change this to 8000. I just wanted to show you that it was working. So I'm going to change that, restart, and now it's back to 8000. Now, what if we want to get a single post? Let's create a route for that. Actually, I'm going to put a comment here. So this is to get all posts. And then what we'll do is just grab that. And I'm going to show you later on how we can create a separate file for routes. But for now, we'll just put it in here. So this will get a single post. And we want to be able to put API/post/ and then whatever the ID. If it's post with an ID of 1, then we want to be able to get it by passing in a 1. So since this is dynamic, this param here, we have to prefix it with a colon and then whatever we want to call the param. In this case, we want to call it ID. You might have if it's a blog post, you might have maybe a slug or something like that, but we're just going to stick with an ID. Now, how do we get whatever is passed here in our function here? Well, we do that, let's console log, we do that with the request object, and on that there's a params object. Let's just go ahead and console log that. So I'll make the request to API post/1, and when I send it, you'll see that now we have an object with an ID of 1, and notice that it is a string by default. Okay, so that's how we can get it. We can do request.params and then .id. Or if this was slug, we could do params.slug. So let's make it so we get that particular post. So what I'll do is, first of all, just create a variable called ID, and I want to parse int. So I want this to go from a string to a number. So we're going to pass that into parse int, request.params.id. Okay, so now we have the ID. Now let's filter the posts. So we're going to respond with JSON, and then we can use filter. And I'm assuming that you guys know filter, that you know all this JavaScript stuff. If not, then you might want to just pause learning Express and kind of get into just JavaScript a little more. But filter will take in a function. Basically, we're going to loop through, and for each post, we want to say if that post, the current iteration, if that post ID is equal to the ID that's passed in right here, which is this variable now, then that's what we want to show. That's what we want to respond with. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's come back here and send. And now you can see we get just the post with the ID of 1. If I do 2, we get the post with the ID of 2. Now if I do, let's say 200, which we know doesn't exist, right now it just gives me an empty array because it's filtering through and it doesn't find a post with that ID. In reality, you should probably have this return a 404 not found with an error message, and we'll get to that. We'll get to error handling. But before we do that, I want to talk about getting query strings. So for instance, if we were to go to API/posts and then do question mark limit equals 2, maybe you want to limit the amount of posts that come back, how do we get this value? Well, we can still use the request object, right, just like we did here, but instead of req.params, it would be req.query. So this is the route we're looking at where we want to be able to get it. So let's just do a console log of req.query. Okay, and then we'll make that request again. And now in the console, you can see we have an object limit 2, and it is a string by default. And if I were to add on to this an ampersand, and then maybe we want like sort equals DESC, now you'll see that that is also added to that object. So let's make the limit work. We won't do the sort now, but let's actually make that limit work. So we'll come back in here. Now, one thing you have to realize when you're dealing with back-end development is anytime a user can change the data, right? Like in this case, you have to just be aware of that and be aware of what you're doing with that data, because it's possible someone could put like an SQL query in here and really screw things up. That's called SQL injection. In this case, obviously we're not even using a database, but you just have to be aware of that. Okay, and the type of data that you expect should be the only type of data that can be accepted. So in this case, we want a number, right? In particular, we want a number that is positive because it's a limit. So let's first of all, let's say put this in a variable. I do want to parse it as a number, so let's say parse int, and we can get it with request.query.limit. Okay, so that'll give us the actual number. And there's a ton of different ways you could handle this. What I'm going to do is just check, and I'm going to say if not nan, or is nan, is NaN, right, which stands for not a number. So is nan is a function that will return true if it's a number and false if it's not. So we want to say if it's not is a number, limit. And then we also want to make sure that it's positive. So we'll say and if that limit is greater than 0. Okay, so if those conditions are true, then we want to respond with JSON, except we want to only return whatever the limit is. So we'll say posts. So we have our post array, and then I'm going to use the slice method and say I want to go from 0 to whatever the limit is. And then we can do an else, and then move this into here, because if there's no limit, then we just want to return all the posts. All right, so let's try that out. We'll save it, and let's try it without any kind of limit, so we still get all 3. But then let's do question mark limit equals 2, we get 2. If we do equals 1, we get 1. All right, if we do 10, it's just going to give us all of them. All right, cool. So that's how you can deal with query strings. Now, status codes are really important. You should have a basic understanding of the main status codes. The ranges, like 200 means success, 300 you have redirects, 400 you have client error, 500 you have server errors. So let's be specific about the actual statuses we're sending back. When you just do res.json, it's going to default to 200. However, I like to still specify 200 explicitly, even though I don't have to. I think it just makes it more readable. So what we can do is do a res.status, and you can pass in the status you want to send back. So in this case, I'm going to say 200, and then you can actually chain on the .json. So we can do it like that. And same thing here, we'll say res.status. And you can just send the status without any content, without the .json. But we do want to send the post back, so we'll say 200 and then .json. All right, same thing down here. So res.status 200. Now let's make it so that when that post doesn't exist, we get a 404 and a message. So I'm actually going to just get rid of that whole thing there. And we want to put the post in a variable because we want to be able to check for it. And we can use find here. So post.find. And let's pass in here. So for each post, and we want where the post.id is equal to ID. And then we can check for that post, or we'll say if not post. So if the post doesn't exist, then let's say res.status, and this time we'll send a 404. And then you don't have to, but I also would like to send a message. So we'll say MSG, and actually let's use backticks here, and we'll say a post with the ID of ID was not found. Okay, and then we'll say else. So if it is, then we'll say res.status, and we want to send it 200. And then as far as the data we send back, that's going to be the post. All right, make sure this is singular, post, not posts. So let's try that out. So if we go to API/post/1, we get post1, go to /2, we get post2. If I go to post/200, then you see over here I get a 404 not found for the status, and we get this message, a post with the ID of 200 was not found. All right, so that's how you can send different statuses, and you always want to make sure that you have a proper response if what you're looking for is not there. Now, just to kind of clean this up a little, I don't really like to have the else's here. So typically what I'll do, we'll start with this where we're making sure that the limit, seeing if the limit's there. Since we have two res.statuses, we can do this and just have an if else, but what I'll usually do is not have the else. So we'll go like that. But if we do it this way, then the first one here we want to return. So that should work the same way. So let's try it out. If we go to /post, okay, so that still works. And then here, instead of using the else, so we'll get rid of this. But this first one, even though it's within an if, we still want to have a return like that. I just think that cleans it up a little bit. All right, so now we know how to create routes. We know how to get route params. We know how to get query params. We know how to send different statuses. Now let's move the routes to a separate file, because you can only imagine if you have a bunch of resources like posts, users, categories, and then you have a bunch of routes for each resource, this file can get filled up pretty quickly. So you're usually going to have a separate file for your different resource routes. So let's create a folder in the root, and we'll call it routes. And let's create a file called posts.js. All right, so in this post.js, we're going to be using the express router. So first off, let's bring in express. And then we're going to be using the router, so we can do that by defining a router variable and then setting that to express dot and then capital R router, like that. All right, so the way that this works, we can actually just copy, or not copy, but cut the two routes that we have here. Okay, so I'm just going to cut them out of that file. We're going to bring the posts into the routes file as well, but let's paste those in. And let's also cut this. Okay, so we'll cut that. So we're really cleaning up the server.js. And we'll put that here. All right, now instead of using app, because obviously we don't have access to app anymore, that's being defined in the server.js, we're now going to use the router. So here, let's replace that with router and replace this one with router. So now anytime we create new routes, we're going to be using the router instead. And then very important, you have to export that at the bottom here. So we want to export as default router. Now we need to bring that in, that routes file, into the server.js. So up at the top here, let's say const posts, and set that to require, and we want to go into, let's see, ./routes/posts, and then we're going to come down here, let's say routes, and what we do is we use app.use, because this is in fact middleware. So in the app.use we can pass in the endpoint that we want to use for that file, which is going to be /API/posts. And then as a second argument, we pass in posts. Now, since we're defining API or /API/posts here, in the actual route file, we don't need to have API/posts here again. So instead, we're going to get rid of this. We still want the ID for this particular route. So this would just be /:ID. And then this would just be /, okay? Because if you were to leave this and that, then it's going to be /API/post twice. Obviously, we don't want that. So let's save and let's make sure that everything, well, looks like we're getting unexpected token export. We're still using CommonJS modules, which I should probably change up. So with CommonJS, we would say module exports router. Okay, so now let's try it out. So API posts, that works. API post 1, that works. All right. Now I do want to switch it up to ES modules. I prefer that over the CommonJS require syntax. So you don't have to do this if you want to stick with this, with the the standard Node.js module syntax, you can. But I like to have the same syntax on the front and back end. So I'm going to go into package.json and I'm going to set type to module instead of CommonJS. Now we need to switch up. Let's go to server.js first. We can replace this with import express from express, and then for path, I know we're not using path right now, but we will be. So import path from path, and let's see, for we're going to import posts from what is it? Yeah, /routes/. Now, when you're using this syntax, the ES modules with Node.js, you do have to do the .js if it's a file. All right, so we'll save that, and then where else do we need to put this? In the actual route file, we're going to replace this. Okay, and I think that's it. Let's see what's going on here. The export. So in this, the post route file, now we can change this module.exports to export default posts. I'm sorry, it's to router. All right. So now everything should work. Let's try it out. Okay, we can get that. Good. So now we're using ES modules. The next thing I want to do is show you how we can get data from the request body. So let's make it so we can make an actual post request and submit a new post. And I know we're not using a database, but we'll just add it to memory. So I'm going to open up a new Postman tab. So we'll say new request, and I'm just going to move this over here. Okay, and I want this to be a post request, and it's going to be the same endpoint, API/posts, but I want to be able to go to the body here and either send raw JSON or use this www form URL encoded, where we can just put, like, title. I think title's the only field that we have for posts. but this kind of replicates a form, a web form. So in order to get the body data, we actually need to add a couple lines of middleware. We don't have to install anything. You used to actually have to install a separate body parser package, but now it's just included with Express. So let's go right here and let's say body parser middleware, and we're going to say app.use and pass in here express.json, like that. So this will take care of being able to submit raw JSON, but again, I also want to be able to use URL encoded data. So we need to add one more line, app.use, and in here we're going to say express.URL encoded, and that just takes in an object, and we're going to set extended to false. So that will allow us to send the form data. Now let's create a new route. So obviously that's going to be in our routes post.js file. So we'll go right here. Let's say create new post, and we're using the router. Now, since this is going to be a post request, instead of router.get, we use router.post. And again, the endpoint is still going to be API/post. So here we just need to put a slash because, remember, we already have this defined right here. So now create a new post, and we'll have our function with req.res. Okay, and then to get the body data, let's just do a console log here. I'm going to do request.body. And if you took the Node.js course, crash course, you remember we did do this, but it was a lot more difficult. You actually got a buffer and then had to turn it into a string. It's much more complicated. Express makes it really easy. And then for the response, we'll just say res.status. Now a 201 means successful, and it means something was created. And then let's also add post. I know we're not actually creating a new post yet, but that's the response we're going to want. So if we go to make a post request to API/post, right, if I just send it as is, then we're getting all the posts, and we just have an empty object. But let's go to this form URL encoded, and let's add title. We'll say my title is the value, and send, and now you can see we get this object of, we have title and my title. So we can access this value right here with req.body.title. So let's go back into here, and if you want to pause the video and try this yourself, basically you're just pushing it onto an array. There's no ORM or anything with a database. If you want to pause it and try it, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and just create a variable called new post. And there's so many ways to do the same thing. That's, like I said earlier about Express, it's very unopinionated, so you can do things how you want. So I'm going to create an object, and let's say ID, and I'm going to just keep it very simple and take the length of the post and then just add one to it for the ID. Okay, so we're keeping it simple. In reality, you'd be adding it to a database, and most of the time the database is going to give you the ID automatically. And then for the title, this is where we can access request.body. Remember, it's that object which will have the title on it. All right, and then let's say if there's not, if that new post doesn't have a title, then let's return a 400, because that means it's a client error. So it's something the person making the request did something wrong. So we're going to say return res.status 400, and then we'll add on a message. So here we'll say message, and we'll say please include a title. Okay. Else, so basically if there is a title, then we just want to add it to the array. So let's say post.push and pass in here our new post. and we're still sending this back. So let's go back to Postman, and I'm just going to change my title to, yeah, I guess we'll just say Brad's post. And I'm going to send, and what I get back is my post, and you can see that there's a new one here with an ID of 4 with the title of Brad's post. Now, obviously, that's not going to persist. If I restart the server, it's going to just go away because it's not being put in a database, but it gives you an idea of how this would work. Also, in reality, you'd have your form, whether it's just regular HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or if you're using React, Vue, Svelte, something like that. Now, I think it's only natural that we finish this as a CRUD API and do a put, which is an update, and also a delete request. So let's go under where we did the post, and let's say update. Yeah, we'll do update post, and we'll take our router, and put is normally what we use for updating. You can also use patch. I prefer put though. And when we update a post, obviously we need to know which one we're updating, so it's going to be API/post/ and then whatever the ID is. And then we'll have our function with our request response. And we want the ID, so remember we can get that. I'm going to parse it. I'm going to parse int, and we can get that with request.params.id. So that'll give us the ID. Then let's get the post. So we'll get that with find. So we'll take the post array and find. And then for each post, we want to get where the post ID is equal to the ID in the URL. Then we'll check for the post. So we'll say if not post, then let's return res, and we're going to do a status of 404 not found. And we'll just put a message in here. And actually, let's use backticks, and we'll say no. What do we do up here? Yeah, we can just copy this. All right, and then to do the update, I'm just going to simply take the title, so post title, and I'm going to set it to request.body.booty, request.body.title, and then we'll do a res status of 200, and we'll send back the posts, and that will include the updated post. So let's try that out. So let's say we want to update / we'll do 2, and I want the title, we'll say updated post, and then we send that, and what we get back, well, we're getting a 404. Oh, that's because I'm making a post request. This should be put. So now you can see ID2, the post with the ID2 has a title of updated post. So that takes care of the put request. Now let's do the delete. So under that, we'll say delete post. So router, actually, you know what? We could just copy what we just did. Delete post, and this is going to be a delete request. Same thing, we need the ID, so we're going to keep that. We're going to parse it as an int, and then we're going to find the post. We're going to check for it, and then let's see. All we're going to do, get rid of that. All I'm going to do is basically overwrite the post. That's why I used let when I define the array. So we'll say post then equals post.filter, and let's pass in our function for each post, and we want to say where the post ID is not equal to ID. So that'll return all the posts except for the one with that ID, and then say that we can leave this because we want to just send back all the posts. with the one that's deleted should be gone. So I guess we could just use this. So let's do delete, and we'll do post/1 send, and now you can see the ID with 1 is gone. So we now have a full CRUD API, create, read, update, and delete. Now, again, obviously in the real world, instead of doing this kind of stuff, you would be working with a database and you'd use some kind of ORM. For instance, if you're using MongoDB as your database, there's an ORM called Mongoose, and it has methods like find, delete, things like that, and you would be finding and deleting from the database rather than from just a hard-coded array like we're doing here. In fact, the code you'd have less code because we have to write more JavaScript to deal with this hard-coded array than we would to just to use a few methods with Mongoose. And if you're using a SQL database, SQLize is a really popular ORM for Node.js. So that takes care of creating an API. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit about middleware. So middleware functions are functions that have access to this request and response object. And they can do anything. I mean, you can use it for logging, you can use it for authentication, you can add to the request object here. For example, a lot of the authentication middlewares will allow you to add like a req.user, and then in your route you have access to the currently logged in user. Now I'm just going to do something simple. We're going to create some logger middleware that will show the method and the endpoint in the console whenever a request is made. And you can have middleware run on either the route level, so in any one of these routes, or at the app level where it runs no matter what route is hit. So let's start off by just creating a function. We're not going to keep this here, but I'm just going to put it here for now. So we'll make this an arrow function. Now, middleware functions take three things in: the request and response. Remember I said they have access to those. And then also next, which is a function that you're going to run at the end of your middleware function. Because what that does is it calls the next piece of middleware in the stack. So in this logger function, let's do a console log. And like I said, we have access to everything that's on this request object, including the method, the protocol, just everything, cookies if you have any. So what I want to do is just log. Let's put some backticks in, and then I want to use a variable, so I'm using the money sign, the template literal syntax. And let's get the method. We'll put that first. And then outside of that curly brace, let's put the protocol, so request.protocol, which would be HTTP. Then we'll put : // and then we can get the host name with req.get, and then just pass in host. Okay, and then after that curly brace, let's put the original URL property. So request.original URL. And then finally we need to call next, which again we'll just call the next piece of middleware in the stack. So as I said, we can implement this on a route level or the app level. So let's start with the route level. Let's say I want this logger to run only on this get all posts route. So for middleware to run, we just have to add it as a second argument. So I can simply pass in logger like that. And now when I hit API/posts, you can see it's logging. It's a GET request, localhost 8000 API posts. If I go to API post/1, then it doesn't run because it's only being passed into this one route. Now you might have middleware where you want it to run on all routes on the app level. So in that case, we're not going to do this, so we can get rid of that. And we don't want this function in this file because we want to use it in our server.js. So commonly what you'll do, let's cut this. Commonly what you'll do is have a folder for your middleware, and we'll create a new file here called logger.js, or you could call it like logger middleware, and we'll paste that in, and then we just want to export that as default Okay, then we'll bring it into our server.js. So let's import logger. That's going to be ./middleware/logger.js. And then all we have to do is wrap it in app.use. That's how we use middleware. So I'll say logger middleware app.use, and we're just going to pass in logger. So now let's make a request. So this is API post 1, and you can see now it's logging that. If I do just API posts, it's still logging it. If I go to the delete, so any request I make now, it's going to log it down in the console. So that's how you can create and implement middleware. So now I want to look at error handling. Now Express comes with a default error handler. If you make a request to something that doesn't exist, like let's say we go API/test, you'll see this is the default error handler. It gives us a 404, but it actually gives us an HTML page. And if you're building an API, obviously that's not what you want. So I want to show you how we can create a custom error handler that will give us a JSON response along with the status code that we want sent. So let's go to our routes, and we'll start with the single post. So basically, wherever we're sending these 404s, I want to, instead of doing that here, I want that to happen in the error handler. So let's actually, all I'm going to do is copy this right here, the message itself, and then I'm going to get rid of this return that's inside here. And I want to be able to go like this, or yeah, we want to be able to do new error. This is what fires off the error handler by saying new error, and we're going to pass in a message like that. Okay, now we do have to call the next function, and next can get passed in as a third parameter up here. So we're going to pass next into the actual route handler. And then underneath where we just said new error, we're going to return next, but we want to pass the error in there as well. So let's do this, error, like that. Okay, so in order for this to work, we have to create an error handler, which is going to be a piece of middleware. So in middleware, let's create a new file called error.js, and we're going to say const error handler. Now, just like any other middleware, this is going to take in request, response, and next. However, the very first thing it's going to take in is error. And just by doing that, just by passing this first error in, it's going to run when we do this. Now, as far as what I want to put in here, for now, let's just do a res.status, and we'll just do 404, and then .json. And for now, I'll just do a hard-coded message. So we'll say MSG, and I'll just say error. And we just want to make sure we export as default. Now to use this, just like any other middleware, we need to wrap it in app.use. So let's bring it into our server.js. So import error handler, and we're going to put the app.use below the routes here. Otherwise, we could have some conflicts. So say error handler app.use. Okay, now it should work if we get that error, right? So if there's no post with the ID that we pass in, then this should run. This should run. So let's try it. Let's go to API/posts/100, and there we go. So we get a 404 not found. We get message error. Now, obviously, we want this to be more specific, right? So we're passing the message in right here, so we can access that through this object. So right here, let's say for the message, instead of just a string of error, let's say error.message. So now we'll try that again, and now we get the correct error message. Now at the moment, it's always going to be a 404, right? And I don't want that. What I want to do is check to see if we set a status in the route. If we didn't, then I want it to be a 500 by default, which is a server error. So what I'm going to do is say if, let's say if the error.status, then we'll say res.status, set it to whatever that error status is, and then .json, and in there we're going to do message and set it to error.message. Okay, else if there is no status defined, then let's make it a 500. So I'll change this to a 500. All right, so now let's try it again. We'll try to get post 100. Now you can see we're getting the correct message, but it's a 500. That's the default. So all we have to do is when we define this error here, right before we return next, we can just do error.status, set that to 404. Now hit send. Now it's a 404. Okay, so if it doesn't have an explicit status code, then it's going to just be 500. Now let's just use the error handler in the other routes where, for instance, where else did we use this? Like right here. So instead of returning the res status JSON, instead of doing it here, we'll let the handler do it. So I'm just going to copy these 3 lines. And let's go, let's see, is there anything up here that we need? No. So create new post. So where we check for the title, let's replace this with this, except I want it to be a 400. And let's say, please include a title. So let's see if that works. If we go and we try to make a post request to API posts and we don't include a title, oh, next is not defined. So in your routes, we just want to make sure that we add next and just add it to all of them. So here, that's better practice anyways, just to make sure we have that. Even if you're not going to use it. There we go. All right, so we'll try that again. Send with no title. And there we go. So we get a 400 bad request, and please include a title. So now let's find where else we can use the error handler. So right here. So a post with the ID. So basically we can do the same thing. So this right here. And then same thing right here. Yeah, I think that's it. So we're just letting it go through the handler rather than doing it here. All right, now I want to have a catch-all for, like I said, if we go to like API/test, which doesn't exist. It's not a post that doesn't exist. It's a URL. It's an endpoint that doesn't exist. It's still giving us that HTML page. So to have kind of like a catch-all, we'll go underneath. Let's see. We're gonna go under these routes. We can do it. So let's say app.use. And let's pass in. So we're just creating another middleware function. So we got res next. And let's say const error equals new error. So same thing we did in the routes. Let's say not found. And the status. So we'll say error dot status. Set it to 404, and then call next and pass in the error. All right, so if we do that, now if I try to go to API test, which isn't an actual endpoint or route, 404 not found, and we get message not found. And we could clean this up a little. Instead of having it in here, we could just create another file and we'll call it notfound.js. And then we'll just take the function here, cut that, we'll say const not found equals so we'll do that, then we'll bring it in up here. Yeah, we'll just do that, and we can just move that down here. I think that makes sense. So now that should do the same thing. If we go to API test, good. So the next thing that I want to do is show you an example of using another package. And we're going to use a small library called colors that allows us to basically just add colors to the console, and we'll make our little logs here pop a little more by adding color to it. So you can either stop the server for a minute, or you can open up another terminal. I'm just going to open up another one, and I'm going to run npm install colors. And if you go to package.json, you should have colors as a dependency. So we're going to be using this in the logger file. Let's just close up some of this stuff that we don't need. And we're going to go to middleware logger.js. And we want to bring in colors. So import colors from colors. And the way that we can use this, I believe we can just, I haven't used this in quite a while, but I believe we can just go like this, add an array, and then put like red. I think that's, let's see, let me just try that. Yeah, see, so now it's red. And right now it doesn't matter which requests we make or anything like that. It's just all going to be red. But what I'd like to do is make it so if it's a get request, we'll make it green. If it's a post request, we'll make it blue, and so on. And there's a lot of ways we could do that. We could have a bunch of if-else, but I think to define an object and define a mapping of HTTP methods to colors would be the cleanest way to do this. So let's go above the console log, and let's say const method colors and set that to an object, and we'll say for get, let's make that green, for post blue, for put we'll do yellow, and then for delete we'll do red. All right, and then all we have to do is let's create a variable called color, set that to our method colors, and then the request.method, because remember we have access to that, or it'll just be white. And then we can just replace this in this array here, replace red with the color variable. So now let's make a get request. You can see that it's green. If I make a post request, blue, put request, I mean, these are not found because it's API test, but it doesn't matter. It's making the request, so it's still going to log. And then delete is red. So it's just you can see how much freedom you have with Express. It's very minimalistic, and you can use all types of libraries to do what you want and create any kind of middleware that you want. You have total control over the whole request response cycle. Now the next thing I'd like to do is move all the functionality from the routes file. I want to have controller methods. I think that that's a cleaner way to do this rather than just having all the logic inside the route file. I just want the route file to point the correct, whatever that endpoint and method, point to a controller method rather than putting everything in here. So this would go in its own function in the controller file. So let's create a new folder called controllers. And then inside controllers, we'll have a file called postcontroller.js. And then in here, we're going to define a bunch of different functions. I'm going to use arrow functions. So for instance, we'll have get posts. And we'll set that. Actually, you know what we could do is just go to our routes post file and just grab this entire function right here and cut it. So we'll cut that, and then we'll set get post equal to that. And what I'll usually do, and if you've ever taken my Node.js courses or MERN-Stack courses, in my controller methods, I like to have a description and a comment just saying what it does. So this will get all posts. And then I also like to put the route. So we'll say a route, in this case, would be a get request to /API/posts. And then I would also put access, but we don't have authentication, so there's no reason to do that. So next we'll have, let's do description, get single post, and then route. This would be /API/post/ and then the ID. Space that out a little more. All right, and then we'll have get post and set that equal to, and we'll grab this, cut that, paste that in. All right, and I'm just going to copy this. So the next one would be to create a post or create new post. And I forgot the method. Yeah, so we want to do that, and then post. Create post, set that to this. Okay, and I'm just going to copy this again. So we got two more. We got the update and the delete. All right, so const all right, so let's grab this. So that's the update. And then we got the delete. Oops. Okay, so these methods have to be exported. You could either do it at the bottom, or you can just simply put export before each one, which is, I guess, what I'm going to do. Okay, so we'll export those. Now we want to import them into the routes file. Oh, this too, obviously we need access to the posts in the controller. So that will go at the very top. Okay, and then from here, let's import from, and then we're going to go, let's see, up one level into controllers, and then postcontroller.js. And then all we have to do is replace what we just cut out with the names. So get posts. This will be get post. So you can see how much we're cleaning this up. And let's see. Get posts is, oh, I didn't bring them in. So right here, we need to bring in get. All right. So everything should still work the same. So if I try to get post 2, okay, that works. If I try to get all posts, if I try to get a post that doesn't exist, okay, error handler's working, good. So I think that this is cleaner to have these named functions here and then to have our routes that just point to those named functions. And I just realized that I have create post here. This should be delete post. All right, now what I want to do next is give you an example of how we can interact with our backend from the front end. And we already have a public folder with some HTML files, and I'm not going to, this is going to be very simple. I'm not going to create a UI with styled CSS or anything. We'll just make it so we can have a button we click and it fetches data. We'll also just have a simple form where we can add a new post, add a title. All right, and we're going to do that. That's why I kept this commented out, because we're going to use this this express static middleware because I want to be able to use those HTML files. Now we're going to have an issue here, and you'll see if I save this, I get an error. And if we look at this, it says _dir name is not defined in ES module scope. The reason this isn't working, this right here, this usually will, you know, get the current directory that you're in. It doesn't work when you're using ES modules. It's in the scope of the common JS modules. However, there is a workaround. So we're going to just add a couple lines here to make this work. So first thing I'm going to do up here, I'm actually going to import a function from the URL package, or the URL module, which is part of Node.js. So we're going to import from URL, and the name of the function is file URL to path. And then basically what we're going to do is create this ourselves, because it's not available to us, because, well, I mean, if you're using common JS, it is available to you, but if you're using this import syntax, it's not. So I'm going to go right here, let's say get the directory name. So first off, we're going to create _file name. That doesn't exist either anymore, but we can create it ourselves by using the file URL to path and then passing in import.meta.url. And what this gives you is your file URL. To the current file we're in, it'll give us like file, it'll look like this, right? And then path to whatever file we're in. I don't want the file URL, I want just the path, and that's what this does, is it gets you just the path. And we can do a console log here of file name, and even though we have the error, it should still show us above that right here. So see this users Brad Traversy desktop, so that's my path, and this is the file, or server.js. To get the path name, or the directory name, let's say const _dir name, all we have to do is then use the path module, and there's a dir name method that we can use, and then we can just pass in that _file name. So now everything works, right? We're not getting any more errors. So now that works, we have our static folder, and if I were to go to localhost 8000, we should see the home page, right? Because I have that index HTML. I also have that about page, so if I go to /about HTML, shows me the about page. Now this index HTML, this is where I want to have some front-end JavaScript to fetch the data from my back end. And you'd probably be using something like React, some kind of front-end framework or library. We're not doing that. We're just using vanilla JavaScript. But the way that you would fetch data and stuff is going to be the same. You're going to use the fetch API or something like Axios. So let's go to the public folder and then index.html. And I'm just going to change a couple things up here. We'll say posts. Again, this isn't going to be like a nice looking UI or anything. So H1, we'll say posts. I'm going to have a button and given an ID of get-posts-btn. We'll say get posts. And then let's have an output ID. And then we need a front-end JavaScript file, so we'll have a script tag with a source, let's say ./js/main.js. That'll be our front-end JavaScript. So in public, let's create a folder called JS, and then create a file called main.js. All right, and then let's go ahead, and I'm sure that you guys don't really need me to explain much here. It's just front-end JavaScript. We're going to use document.query selector, and I want to get that output ID element. And let's also get the button. So get-posts-btn, and we'll call this button. All right. And then I'm going to have a function. We'll make this an async because I'm going to be using async await. So we'll make an async function called show posts. And let's just say get and show posts. All right, so we'll say const res, set that to await fetch. And we want to fetch from our API, so HTTP and localhost port 8000 /API/post. Same endpoint that we've been using in Postman. And then we'll say if, so if not res.ok, so if something goes wrong and we can't fetch, then let's just do throw new error. We'll say failed to fetch posts. Okay, then underneath that, let's say const posts, set that to await the res.json, and we're going to take the output dot inner HTML. I'm going to set that to an empty string to begin with. Okay, then we're going to loop through the posts. So we'll say post.forEach. I mean, there's a million ways to do this. This is just a very quick way. So let's say for each post, then we're going to, let's say post element. We'll set that to document dot. So I'm going to create an element for each post. And that element will be a div. Okay, then we'll take our post element div and let's add some text content and set that to the post.title. And then we're going to take the output and append child, and we want to append that post element. Okay, we should probably put this in a try catch. So let's do that. Just take this. Okay, and in the catch, just do a console log, and we'll say error fetching posts. All right, now we just need an event listener. So let's say event listeners. We'll have the button, and let's listen for a click event. And when we click that, we're going to call show posts. All right, So let's go to our home page. And now if I click Get Posts, there we go. Post 1, 2, and 3. All right, if I were to add a new post by making a post request of a title, let's say new post, send, okay, and then I go back here. There we go, see our new post. So now let's make it so we actually have a form here, an input that we can add a new post. So let's go back to the HTML. And I mean, I know that a lot of you guys probably already know this stuff, but it's just for those of you that aren't really familiar with full stack development, how we can interact with our API, with our back end from the front end. So I'm going to add just a very simple form. So we'll put this, let's see, we'll just put this under the H1. Let's say form, no action, but I am going to give it an ID of add post form. And we'll give it a label, let's say for title. And I'm just going to put a line break. I'm not using any CSS at all. So we'll put an input. Let's give it an ID of title. Type is going to be text. We'll give it a name of title. And we'll put a line break here as well. And then let's do a button. Give it a type of submit. Okay, so we should now have a very ugly looking form. And when we submit this, obviously we want to make a post request and add some data, add a post. So let's go back to our main.js, our front-end JavaScript, and let's create a function. So this will be also async function. We'll call it add post. And I'm going to pass in our event param. We want to prevent the default behavior, so e.prevent default. Then for the form data, I'm going to set that equal to a new form data object and pass in this. And then we can get the title with form data dot get and title. All right, so that'll give us the title. Then for the request, I'm going to put that in a try catch. And let's say const res, set that to await fetch. And we're going to make a request to HTTP localhost 8000/API/posts. Now we want this to be a post request, so we're going to pass in an options object as a second argument with a method of post, and we're going to set headers, and we want to set the content type. I want to set that to application/JSON, and the body, so the data we're going to send, we're going to wrap this in JSON.stringify and pass in an object with the title. All right, and then after that, let's check to see if it's not okay. So we'll say if not res.okay, then throw we'll say throw new error and failed to add post. Okay, then here let's say const new post, set that to await res.json. Then I'm going to create post element document dot create element. That's going to be a div. Okay, then we're going to take that post element and we're going to add text content, which is going to be the new post dot title, and then we just want to append that to the output. So output pen child, post element, and then in the catch here, let's just do we'll do a console.error. All right. And then we just need another event listener. That's going to be on the form, which did I bring in? I didn't bring that in. So up here, add post form, it's going to be a submit, and it's going to call add post. All right, and actually we want to let's show the post after too. So right at the end here, we can just call show post. This is just very, very quick JavaScript that I just created. So this should work though. So let's reload it. Let's go ahead and say Brad's post, add post, and there we go. And I can, keep adding them. Cool. So just an example of front-end JavaScript working with our back-end API. So where are we at now? I think that I've covered everything I wanted to as far as, building an API. I do want to get a little bit into template engines because you might want to build just a server-side app similar to like what you would do with PHP. And there's a bunch of template engines you can use. EJS, embedded JavaScript, is my favorite. I think it's very similar to how PHP works as far as the tags go and all that. And I don't want to use it in this project. So I think what I'll do is just create a whole new folder and go from there. So I'm going to stop this server. And I'm going to close that up and then create something else. So let's do, this isn't going to be very long. I'm not going to get too deep into it. So let's create, I'll make a directory, call this express2, cd into express2, and open up VS Code. All right, let's put this in here, my little square. Okay, so we're going to basically just start from scratch here, but I'm going to go kind of quick. So npm init, and then we're going to create, I'm going to call it app.js this time. And let's install Express, npm install Express. Now we're also using EJS, so let's install that as well. So Express and EJS. Those should get added as dependencies. And then I'm just going to add a script, start script here. So this will be node, not server, node app. And then let's do a dev. And this will be node -- watch app. And let's use ES modules. You don't have to, but I just prefer it. So we'll say not module type and module. All right. So we'll just create a basic server. So we want to initialize Express. And we want to listen. I'm not going to bother with environment variables or anything like that. Just say server started. All right, so the way that we configure EJS is actually very simple. So let's say config EJS. So basically we just got to set the view engine. So we do that with app.set. And we want to set view engine. And then we also want to pass in EJS. as a string. Then we also want to set the folder that we want as our views folder. So let's say app.set. I think it's views by default, so you might not need to add this, but I do anyways. So we want to set the views folder to a folder called views. All right, and then let's see, we'll create our route. Let's say app.get. So app.get slash and request response. Now, since we're using a template engine, we have access to res.render. So if I say res.render and I pass in here index, it's going to look for an index page in my views folder. So let's create that. Let's say new folder views, and inside that we're going to create index dot, and it's going to be EJS is the extension that we want to use. And in here, let's just create like a basic HTML. I'll just say welcome h1 welcome. All right, now I'm going to run the server, so npm run dev. So server started. Now let's go to the browser. Let's go to localhost 8000 and we get welcome. Okay, so it's using Vue.js. It's using EJS. Now what's really cool about these template engines is not just that we can render HTML pages, I showed you that in the very beginning, but we can pass in dynamic data, right? So if you fetch data from a database, you can pass it into the view. Now I'm not using a database, but just to show you how to pass data, we can just add an object as a second argument here, and let's say we want to pass in title. So we'll say title welcome. And then let's say message, and we'll say hello from EJS. All right, so I'm passing these variables in, title and message, and then I can go into my page that I'm rendering. Let's say for the title, instead of welcome, I want to show that variable, and the syntax for this is going to be an angle bracket and then %, and then equals, and then whatever the variable, and then close it with % brackets. So very similar to PHP. And then let's say where I have this h1, that's where I want to put the message. So again, I'll use my % equals, and then message, and then % angle bracket. Okay, so now we'll check that out. If I reload, we get welcome in the tab here, and that's coming from this, right? If I say my website, so now my website in the title, we got hello from EJS, which is the message. So you can pass this dynamic data in. You can also pass in arrays. So let's say we want to pass in, we'll say people, make that an array, John, Jane, and Jack. All right, so now I got these people, and ultimately these would most likely come from a database. And then let's say I want to put them in a UL, so I'll use my EJS syntax, and we can take that people variable, which is an array, and then do for each, and say person, and open curly brace, and then we can close off this line, and then down here we'll open up another one, and that's where we'll have our closing curly brace in parentheses. And then in the middle here we could put an li, and then we could output each person. Okay, so let's try that. Reload, and there we go. So this is good if you have something, if you have a project where you don't really need a very dynamic UI, and you just want to fetch data, show it, stuff like that. I mean, EJS, something like EJS could be a really good option. You can also have partials. So for instance, if we're going to have multiple pages and we want a header on every page, obviously we don't want to put the header code, the header HTML in every single view. So we can create, let's do a folder here called partials inside the views folder, and we'll create header.ejs. And let's just put a header with an h1. Okay, and then if I want to include that in my index file, I can use an include. So I'll go right here, and the syntax for this, it's changed from back in the day. Now you're going to do a hyphen like that, and then you can do include, and then the location, which is going to be partials slash, the location is going to be from within the views folder. So .ejs, and then close that off. So now you can see now we have the header showing. All right, and you can also have layouts, obviously, so you don't have to repeat yourself with this stuff. But I'm not going to get too much into this. I just wanted to show you it is possible. You don't always have to build APIs with Express. But hopefully you guys learned a little something from this. I know a lot of you probably already knew a lot of this stuff, but even if you did, hopefully you could pick one or two things up. And for those of you that are new to Express, if you're overwhelmed, don't worry about it. Things will start to click as the more you work with it. But that's it, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.